Hi, in this video we'll be looking at how to use Sharperlight to return historical and current financial data with a special focus on currency exchange rates, though we can also bring back stock prices and indices as well. We'll start the examples with a simple scenario where we can just bring back today's rate for a particular currency rate, then move on to bringing back the last 2 years for a particular currency rate, and then weekly average rates, monthly average rates. Then we'll look at creating a report that will use these currency rates using a subquery, and then finally moving into the web and producing a report that will chart particular currencies or stock prices. And right at the end, the most advanced example where we actually integrate the currency rates into the particular system that we're reporting out of. Let's have a quick look at some of the examples, starting with the daily rates. I've used Excel to demonstrate a list of a currency pair over time, and you can see up here in the top we have pounds and euros, and if we were to type in pounds and US dollars and hit enter, you'll see the chart has changed and we've pulled back the daily rate over the last 2 years. Now this is going out to Google financial data to pull these rates back. So there are some limitations that we need to be aware of, which I'll explain during the demonstration. Next, we have the weekly rates, and for the weekly rates we've gone back over the last 15 years. And just as before, we can change the currency pair, which is for example pounds US dollars, and you can see there's the current daily rate, and we've gone back all the way to the year 2000, and this is the average rate for that particular week, and we've graphed the data here. This sort of currency exchange rate table has been used in the next example, which is a revenue report, and here we have a posting date and a particular account and amount, and what we've done is created a materialized query over those rates so that we can look up that particular date and return the foreign currency value. And just as before, we can change the currency and have the report show the values in that particular currency. Though this example is using a subquery, we could have used the traditional VLOOKUP approach in Excel to bring back these rates. And towards the end of the video, we'll be creating a report that not only deals with currencies but can chart or display data on particular stock prices. So in this example here we have the NASDAQ and the Google share price, and so we can either chart that or show that as a particular table. And here we have the Google financial data, which is the source of the currency rates and also the share prices. Just before we move into the examples, I'd just like to review one of the previous videos where we showed that Sharperlight not only can go out to services like Google Finances or Yahoo, but it can also go out to web pages and return content. So in that video we discussed how we could create a dashboard like this where we have currency rates, we have Google spreadsheets, and also feeding off RSS feeds. So let's go to the first example where we have a currency pair and we want to bring back today's rate. Let's create a new worksheet, and at the top type in currency and then put in the code for the currency pair. I'm using pounds and euros. Then come to the side of that, and from the Sharperlight menu select value. This is going to bring back a single value in the cell that we selected. From the product list select system, and from the table list go to the internet folder and select the financial data spot, which will bring back the current rates as of now. When you select that, you'll notice that by default the category is already set to currency and it has a currency pair already pre-selected. If we have a look at the possible categories that you can select from, it's not only currencies but it's the various exchanges around the world and also the various indexes. Let's leave that on currency, and for the currency code let's refer back to the cell in the spreadsheet. and I've just double clicked on that and it's brought back the pounds euros. Now from the list here we have the category, the code, but the one that we're really after is the spot price. I'm just going to output all the values just so we can see current state of that currency. There's the date as of today, and there's the spot, and there's the movement in the price. So all I really require from here is the spot price. So I'm just going to pull that out and press OK, and you can see there it's come back into the spreadsheet. If I want to confirm if that spot really is accurate or not, I'm just going to Google that same currency pair. So let's look at pounds, euros, and you can see that it's 1.26, which is marrying up with what we're getting in the spreadsheet. If I wanted to change the currency pair, I could then type in British pounds and, for example, US dollars, and you can see the values here has been updated. Let's move on now to bringing back the last 2 years of that particular currency pair. So this time, just under the previous example, select Table, select the product as System, and from the System table list, go to Internet and Financial Data Historical. It has a category which is set to currency, and then we've got the currency code pair. So we'll set that back as the pounds, US dollars that are in that particular cell. And next we have the interval. You can see that the interval is currently set at 1 day, and then we've got the period. So M6 represents the last 6 months. We can change that to be the last 2 years. It doesn't really matter if you go Y2 or 2Y. So that'll bring back the rate for each day over the last 2 years. And I like to display the code, the date, and then you've got the close, high, low. For currencies, just the closing price is set. But if we were to look at stock prices, the high, low, open and volume are also set. Before putting that into the spreadsheet, let's preview the data. You can see it's gone back to 2012, and there's our rate here. Now this rate looks as if it's been rounded off, but if we were to improve the precision in the preview by setting the format to display more decimal places, you'll see that the whole precision is indeed there. So if we press OK now, that will go back into the spreadsheet. Now there are some limitations with Google Financials in that how far we can go back with a particular interval. So the rule of thumb is, if you want to have a daily rate like we have here, we can only go back 2 years. If we want to go back, for example, 15 years, we're going to have to set the interval to something higher, which is 7 days. So if we don't do that, we'll find that particular days will drop off. So 1 day for 2 years, or if you want to return more than 2 years, set it at a weekly interval. Okay, let's try this table. I'm going to change the currency pair to be euros, pounds, euros, and you can see the table's been updated. The next step would be, for example, to use this table as a VLOOKUP to drive the rates on other reports. So before we move into the next report, let's just do a quick graph of this. So we're going to select the date and the close column and insert the chart. For the next example, we'll be looking at producing a table of the weekly average rates going back 15 or 10 years, or whatever your requirement is. In the case of Google Financials, their limit appears to be back to the year 2000, which should be adequate in most cases. So I've created a table, and I've actually manufactured the from and to. Then we have the closing rate. So this from and to is quite helpful in looking up a particular rate. Just as we did before, I'll create a new workbook, and at the top I'll enter in currency and the currency pair. And below that we'll start the table. So I'm selected table, and I've gone to the product system, and from the table list let's select historical. We'll set the currency code to reference the worksheet by double clicking on the cell, and that's brought in the currency. And the interval, as I was explaining before, needs to be set to 1 week if we're going to go back more than 2 years. So D7 for 7 days, and the period over which we'd like to pull back the data is the last 15 years. So I'm going to go 15 years. And then from the list, we'll select the code, the date, and then the closing rate. Let's preview this data, and you can see it's gone back to the year 2000, and the date is jumping by 7 days. What I'd like to do now is manufacture another column so that we have the from and to date. So this column here will be the to date, and the from date will actually be this previous date plus 1. To do that, I'm going to use a expression. So let's go back to the query, and I'm going to right click on the date and add expression. So as I was explaining before, we need to get the previous date and add 1 day to it. So let's come down to the function list here, and you can see that we can get the values from the previous row. So I'm just going to open up previous row, and there's our previous date. So I'm just going to enter that in, and we need to add 1 day to this. So from the find list, I'm going to go date add, and you can see there's a function that will add 1 day to a particular value. So I'm just going to double click that, and you can see that it requires the date, which is going to be the previous date, comma 1. So that'll add 1 day to the previous date. And if I set the data type to date, we can now press OK, and I'm just going to change the description to say from date, and drag that up, and we'll preview the data. Now you can see that it's taken the previous date and added 1 day to it, which is just what we need. So when we do a lookup on this table, it'll be much more easier to find out if the date falls between this particular range. There is one complication with this though, is the very first record is going back to the year 0, and that will cause issues if we let that through, because it'll be considered an invalid date. So we need to detect the very first one, that if that's null, we'll set it to begin at the year 1900. So let's go back and modify that expression just to use an if statement. So IA if, and we'll take the previous date and just detect if that's null or not. So is null. So if it's null, we'd like to set a date of 1900. So the year is 1900 and the month and the day. Otherwise, we'll use that value we've calculated from before. If you don't follow this expression, just use it as a general rule, and you'll find that it does exactly what you want. To find these values, I've just done a find in the list below. Let's preview the results now. You can see the very first from date is now set to 1900, which is going to deal with that invalid date issue. This data looks fine now, so we'll press OK and have it come back into the worksheet. Now for most Excel reporting, we could just use VLOOKUPs now to look for a date between these ranges and then pick up the currency rate. But for the next report, we're going to do something a little bit more complicated than that, in that we're going to take this particular table and turn it into a materialized query. Now the reason why we want to do that is because once it's a materialized query, it acts like a table that any report can then look up its rates from, including the web. And in addition to that, instead of going out to the cloud, it's going to be stored locally, so it's going to be much faster to look up and refresh those currency rates. So let's have a quick look at the second example. So here's our report. Again, we have the currency up here, and you can see that we've restricted it to only 3 currencies: pounds, euros, pounds US dollars, and pounds Australian dollars. And based on the revenue for that particular day, we've looked up the rate and then multiplied it by the amount to get the amount in that particular target currency. So this report's using a subquery, and if we have a look at the subquery, it's using a materialized query database to look up the currencies. Here's the materialized query table. So this is stored locally on your server, and it doesn't have to go out to the cloud to pull down that data. So it's going to be quite fast. Let's go back to our weekly averaged exchange rates and double click on the table that we created earlier. So this is the table that we'd like to make a snapshot of and store locally. So let's right click and select Materialize Query. If you haven't created a database already, you'll need to create one by selecting New and have the permissions to do that. I've already created one, so I'm just going to double click on that database, and I'll select New, and by default it'll bring up the query that we were working on previously. And if we preview that, you can see there's our currency, and we've got our from and to, and then the actual rate for that period. Now I'd like this table to hold more than one currency. So I've got pounds, euros, but in addition to that, I'd like to add on the end of the list pounds US dollars and pounds Australian dollars. So we need to union another query on the end of this. So let's do that. So on the outputs, select from the list Query Unions. So I'm just going to press there, and over here we have New, and there's our next query that will be appended to the previous one. So select Edit Query, and for this particular set I'm going to change the currency pair to be pounds US dollars. Now if the currency pair that you're after is not in this list, don't worry about that. You can simply type in the currency pair, and as long as it's supported by Google, the rates will come back. So again, we've got the interval set at 7 days, so we're going to get an average, and we'll go back 15 years. So I'll press OK to that, to say yes to this. So there's our pounds, euros, pounds, US dollars, and we'll do one more, which will be, to edit the query, pounds, Australian dollars. I'm going to press OK now, and go back to the main query, which is this. You can see there's a button here saying Query Unions, so I can go back and edit those. So I'm just going to preview at the top level, and just as we saw before, there's our pound euros, but if I scroll down, you'll see on the end we have US dollars, and as we scroll down further we'll have Australian dollars. But you can see that there are some totals put into this data set, which we really don't want because we're going to be using this as a lookup. So let's go back into the unions and turn off those totals between the sections. So selecting the query unions, and if we select the first one, you can see there's some options here about turning off grand totals, etc. So just select the bottom one, which is hide the total row, and we'll go to the US dollar one and do the same there, and then hide the total for the Australian dollars as well. And if we preview that data, you can see there are no totals polluting that set now. Right, so this is ready to seed a materialized query, so I'll press OK, and Sharperlight will create the materialized query. Right, so here's the screen with all the options on the materialized query, and what we can do now is give the materialized query a description. So I'm going to leave it as financial data historical, and then I'll put in weekly averages. And the base currency is going to be pounds, so I'm just going to put that in the title as well. Now if I was just to press OK, this snapshot of the currency rates would be kept locally, but there's no particular trigger point to update it. So if I come across to options, I could say, for example, that the data should be refreshed at least once a day. So if we ever use this currency rate table and it was more than a day old, it would automatically update itself. Now normally you would run some sort of scheduler to do that once a day in the morning, but just by doing this, this should be good enough, even without the scheduling. So I'm going to press OK now, and you can see it's actually created the table. Now that the table's created, instead of going out live to the cloud, we can now use this table for currency rate lookup. So I'm going to press OK there and close this window, and I'll come across to a new sheet, and I'd like to show you what that materialized query looks like. So there's our system, and if I went to historical data, I'd be going out to the cloud and pulling down historical data live. So instead of doing that, we'll go to the product list and let's select the materialized query database. It'll have whatever name you've called it, and then from there there's the tables that we've created, and the one I just created before was the weekly averages GP. And once I select that, there's the columns that we created, and if I just preview that, you could see that there's the pounds, Australian dollars, the euros, and the US dollars. So we have a lookup list that crosses more than one currency. If I was to refresh this workbook the following day, this table would automatically be updated, given that we said that that list should never be more than a day old. Now we have the materialized query of the average weekly rates. We can start on the third example, which is the revenue report. So here we have the posting date, and we're going to do a subquery to that table we just created to look up the rate and then multiply the amount by that. So just as we've done before, we'll start by creating a cell with the currency pair that we're wanting to report over, which is pounds euros, and just under that we'll start the table. So I'm going to select table, and this time I'm going to use a product called SAP Business One to do the transactional reporting, and from the company list I'll use the UK office, and the table will be a GL transactions table. I've just cut ahead here where I've created a few filters, and I've pulled out things like the posting date, the account code, and the amount. And if I preview that, you can see it's got data that goes way back to 2006. That's why we needed to create the materialized query with at least 15 years of exchange rates. So what we'd like to do is multiply this amount here for the exchange rate of the target currency for whatever rate applies for that particular date. We'll come back to the filter area of the query, and the first job that we need to do is bring in this currency pair into the query so that we can then reference it and pass it to the subquery. You can see that there's nothing really here talking about currencies, but that's not a problem. What we can do is right click and select other and text, because we'd like to just bring that value in. I know it's called text, but we can rename that. So I'm just going to change the description and call this currency. So that's the description, and for reference purposes we use the name. So I'm going to set that to currency as well, and to bring the value in, I'll give the focus to the from value, and then double click on the spreadsheet, and you can see it's brought the currency pair value into the filter area. Now these others are just a means of bringing in referential information without actually affecting the report. So this report's not going to be restricted to by this particular code at all. It's just bringing the value in. So now we have the currency, we can come down to the output section and right click near the amount column and select add subquery. When you do that, it'll automatically go to aggregation mode because we're trying to bring back a single value, and it'll use the same starting point as the parent. But in our case, we need to change the product to go to our rates table, our weekly average rates table held in the materialized query database. So I'm going to select our database, and then from the table list, the one that we created earlier, which is weekly average GP, and you can see there's our columns that we created earlier. So here's where we need to define the filter criteria to make sure that we get the right currency, and then the posting date is within the ranges that we defined in this table. So here's our code, and if we have a look at the drop down list here, you can see there's references back to the names that we in the parent query. So the @ symbols are the filters and the percentages are the outputs. So we want to make sure that the code is the same as the currency pair that we passed into the parent query. So I'm just going to say that that's exactly the same as the parent. And for the from date and the to date, I should have renamed that, but I've left it as date. So the from date will need to be smaller or equal to the posting date on the report row. So there's that post date. In your case, it may be another form of date. So just select the appropriate name. And the to date, which is going to be, must be greater or equal to that posting date. And that way, if the posting date will have to fall between these from and to dates, and the currency will need to be the same for us to get the rate. Right, so this is the important part, is to make sure that we get these filter criteria correct. Let's press OK now, and now we have our subquery, and let's preview the data. Now because I've married them up correctly, I'm actually finding a currency rate for that particular day. So I could go back to our table and just confirm that that really was the rate for that week that that day falls into. And if we scroll down, there's no holes in the particular lookup. If something was wrong, you'd find that we didn't find a currency match for a particular day, and it'd be 0 here. So now we have the rate. The next thing is to create a expression to multiply the amount by the rate. I'm just going to change the description of that subquery and call it rate. And under that, we'll create a expression, and the expression will go to the current row, and I'll just double click on amount times, and here we have that rate, and the value is going to be decimal. And let's give this a nice name. So I'm just going to be amount FC for foreign currency. I'm just going back to the rate, and under the format options you can increase the number of decimal places. This is important if you're publishing the report in the web, but if it's Excel, you do all the formatting in Excel itself. So let's preview those results, and you can see there's our amount, our currency rate that it's found, and there's the converted amount. Let's press OK now, and you can see there's our report. And what I'd like to do is actually change the currency pair. So this time I'll use US dollars, and when I hit enter, you can see that this particular column is changed and the rates have changed as well. Let's just take this report one more step, in that this particular column here, where it says amount foreign currency, really what I want to do is show whatever the filter value for the currency pair is in the actual label itself. So let's go back into that report and look at the label for the amount foreign currency, and if I just double click on that and go to the general tab, you can see here's our description for that particular column. Now what I'd like to do is take that currency filter value and actually display it in here. So if we go to, let's delete foreign currency, and if we go to the list, you can see we can place in this description various expressions to calculate things, but I simply want to drop in a reference to the filter value. So you can see that the filter is called currency. So if I was to select that right now, it would create an expression. So I really don't want that. I just want to copy a reference to that without doing anything too complicated, and I'll just paste that alongside the amount. So this is not an expression, it's just a series of labels with the filter value coming in here. So let's press OK to that, and now you can see that the currency pair is appearing in the label above the top. Now while we're dealing with this report, I'd like to show some other features in the expressions. So I'm just going to come back in and edit this report, and you can see that we have a subquery that's looking up the rate, and then we have a amount that's using the rate to calculate the final result. There are other expressions that we can use as well. For example, I'll just add expression here, and I'll come down the list to financial data, and you can see here that we have various templates for bringing back rates or stock prices as they are of today. So this is not historical data, it's spot prices. So let's have a look at the Google Financial Spot Currency Exchange Rate. So if I click on that, you can see there's our mode or our category, which is currency, and there's the currency pair that we're after. So if I was just after today's rate in a report, I could use this to pick up the rate and then multiply it by the amount. You notice that all these expressions have internet required written beside them. So if you've set up Sharperlight as a service, you just need to make sure that that service has access to the internet. And if Sharperlight, the service, or the PC that you're on, doesn't have access to the internet, none of the exchange rates or stock prices will be able to pull down from the cloud. For that reason, if you do set up a service, just make sure that at the very minimum, Sharperlight has access to port 443, which is a secure port. And if some of the web scraping techniques are required, which was shown in a previous video, then port 80 would sometimes be required. Now we'll leave Excel and move into the browser, and what we'll do is create this type of report where we can put in a particular category of exchange, for example the NASDAQ, and then the code for a particular company that we're after and how far back we want to go, and of course displaying as a chart or a table of results. So let's start the process by going into Publisher, and from the list select New. So let's put in the title for the report, which will be Financial History Training, and we'll come down to the Edit Query button, and here we have the query builder. So we'll leave the mode as summary and come to the product, which is System, and from the table list come into the Internet folder and select Financial Data Historical. And you can see there's the defaults, which is currency and then a particular currency pair. So what I'd like to do is start this report by displaying pounds, euros, and then the day interval, because I'd like to display historical data that goes quite a ways back, we need to set that to 7 days. Now if we didn't do this and we went back, for example 5 or 10 years, you'd find that some of the data may be missing. So 7-day intervals is the way to get accurate data over a long period of time. And by default we'll go back 1 year. So in the chart, what we'd like to display is the date, and we can bring out the closing price, the high and the low, and the open. Now if I brought out volume, not all the if I was to bring out volume, you'd find that if I was working with some share prices, the volume would be populated, but depending on the code, volume's not always populated. And for currencies, really close is the only thing that's populated. But let's just choose these 4, and if I preview that, you can see, because it's a currency, we're only getting the first value. Now this is being published in the web, so we need to look at the formatting. So if I just come into the close and increase the number of decimal places, I'll display that to 5 decimal places. I think that's adequate for the time being, so I'm going to press OK and apply. I haven't changed the code or the group yet because this is just an example, a training report. So there's the link to our report. So I'm going to press copy, and then we can come to our browser and paste in that link. You can see up the top here we have our currency, our code, the interval, and how far back we want to go. And if I submit that, it's been displayed as a table at the moment. In our original example, we had another filter here where we could actually choose the type of output we wanted, and I probably don't want them to change the interval, so I'm going to hide that so they can just choose how far back they want to go, but we're going to force that to be 7-day intervals because that's the safest setting. And then of course they can change the category in the code to be anything at all. Let's come back to the report and let's have a look at the chart tab. So you can see by default chart is using a column, and I'd like to change that to be an area chart. And on the axis I'll just increase the number of decimal places so that we can see at least 5 of those. And if I come to the report tab, you can see by default the report's going to display a table. So let's change that to be chart. So I'm going to press OK, apply, and if I refresh this page now, you can see that it's going to a chart by default. So the next step is to hide the interval and place a special type of filter so we can change the medium of the output. Come back to the publish query and edit the query and go to the interval and right click and select hide. So the user can't change that, but they can change the period in the code, for example. Then just on period, right click and select other. What we want from this list is the output format, and it's created this filter, and what I'd like to do is default the output format to be a chart by default. If I was to look at the options there, you can see it's created a list of all the different output formats that you can choose from. So if you didn't want a particular format to be in the list, you could delete it from this line here. Okay, let's press OK and apply, and then refresh the page. You can see that the interval's gone now, and now we can choose the type of report that's to be displayed. So let's choose PDF, and you can see here's a table of the date and then the actual rate on that day for that particular currency. What I'd like to do now is explore some of the categories and their codes. So instead of displaying pounds, euros, let's go to Google Finance, and I'd like to display the NASDAQ prices for Google. So I'm just going to Google this, and you can see here's an entry saying NASDAQ Google. So there's the current share price, and if you just have a look on their page, they give you the actual category and the code associated with that particular stock. So I'm just going to copy that in, and for the code it was like this, and let's set that to a chart again. So that's the price over the last year, and I can take out the highs, and we can also go back further by saying we'd like to see that for the last 3 years. Next, I'd like to show you how we can do the Dow Jones index. So if I have a look at the category list, and from this list I'm looking at the indexes, and there's our NASDAQ, and in this list there should be the Dow Jones. So if we were to compare the data and our chart, things will pretty well much marry up. Finally, let's have a look at the more complicated scenario where we'd like to bring in the exchange rates and make them appear as if they're part of the main product. So you can see here's our report we created earlier, and if I go in and if I edit the query, you can see that we've used a subquery to go off to the materialized query to look up those rates. But What I'd like to do now is show you how you can bring those rates into a particular product and make them look as if they're part of that product, so we don't have to go out to the materialized query database. So you can see here that I've created a custom table and I've brought in those weekly rates as part of a table under the SAP Business One data model. Not only have I done that to make it look as if it's part of the product, but I've gone to the GL transactions table, and right next to the amount I've done a join to that weekly rates table, and I've set it up so that this join will actually pick up the rate for that particular posting date. So it makes it a lot easier for someone to produce a report to get the rate for that particular date. And then of course we can then create a custom field that multiplies that amount by that rate. So right out of the box we have a amount that's adjusted for a particular currency. So in this example I've set this join up. Let's just view the information so that it takes the posting date, looks up and compares with the from and to date, and then it's assuming that we always want pounds, euros. These steps are for consultants, they're not for the average user, but once this is set up, it certainly makes it easier to bring in those rates. So let's start the process by creating a custom table which will bring our currency conversion rates into the main product list. To create a custom table, let's go back to one of the previous examples where we used our materialized query and we created a materialized query. So you can see that this table is coming from our materialized query database. So let's preview that, and there's our currency and our rate. Now to create a custom table we need some SQL, so just come down to SQL and there's the materialized query SQL. So let's copy that. We don't need the group by section, so I'm just going to copy up to select and put that on the clipboard, and then we come across to the main table list and right click and select custom tables. You can see I've created various custom tables, but I'd like to create a new one, and I'd like to put that custom table instead of having it inside materialized queries, I want to make it look like it's part of SAP Business One. So I'm going to select that, and then it's asking me if I've got some SQL. Now there is a caveat to doing this, in that the materialized query database needs to be on the same database server as the system you want to report out of. For example, SAP Business One and Sharperlight are on the same server, so this is going to work. So just let's paste in that SQL that we had, and we'll remove that top. So there's our code, and this will be our from date. So I'm just going to say from date, give the table a nice name, as to date, and instead of saying closing I'll call this as rate. Here's the description, so I'm going to call this the average weekly rate, British pounds. So this will be our custom table, and I'm going to press OK, and we have a new one in the list. So I'll close that. So now if we go to SAP Business One and select our tables and come to custom tables, you'll see that here is the new custom table that we've created. So it looks as if it's part of that product, and just as before we can select the fields and see all the currency conversions for particular pairs. So now we've got the table and it appears as if it's in SAP. The next step is to do a join to that table from inside SAP. So the table we're interested in is the GL transactions, and I'm coming down to the amount, and this is where we'd like to do the join to that particular table. So I'm just going to go right click, customize, add join. There are other videos that explain how to use custom joins and custom fields where you extend the data model, to do calculations and joins and relationships that don't exist currently. So from the join to table list, let's do a search for that custom table, which was average weekly rate. So select that, and then come down to the join criteria. Select the lookup button, and here's the list of columns we want to join from, and here's the weekly rate table that we'll join to. So I'm just going to do a search for the posting date. So the actual underlying column is called ref date, and I like to join that up with the from, and I don't have a to, so I'm just going to select to, and then the code, and it's just building up a bit of a template here. So let's bring that template down to the bottom where we can edit it. So I'll just select add it, and we'll enter a carriage return there. So there's our from date. So our from date needs to be greater or equal to the reference date, and our to date needs to be smaller or equal to that reference date. And then finally the code, what shall that be? So we need to choose one of the currency pairs from that list. We can't bring back 3 rates for that amount because that will produce more rows in the report. So we need to lock it down. So I'm going to choose pounds, euros. So this join is always going to assume that we're after euros. We could add another join for US dollars, for example, so that the user could decide which rate they wanted to pick up. So we've locked it down to euros. Press OK, and here we have the description for that particular join, and what I'm going to do is, that's the name of the table, and I'm just going to put on the end of here euro, and I can go even one more step and make the code for that particular join euro to make it very clear that we're getting euros here. So let's press OK, and you can see now right next to the amount we have a join to that custom table. And if I was to pull out the rate, and just so we can see what's going on, I'll bring out the from and to, and here's the amount and the posting date, and I'll bring out the account as well. Let's press preview and go back in history a little bit and preview the data. And you can see here I've made a mistake with that that join logic. I actually got it around the wrong way, so I'm getting no hits at all. So let's go back in and edit that join. Edit, and I think I got the comparison operators around the wrong way. So here's the join, and I said the from date needs to be greater or equal to the reference date, which is the post date. So I just need to reverse that, so it actually has to be smaller or equal to, and the to date needs to be greater or equal to. So press OK. So we've adjusted the join now, and if we preview the data, now we're finding hits. So if we look at that posting date, it should fall between these from and to dates, and here's the rate that it's found. So in closing, what I've shown is that we can use historical and current financial data held in the cloud by organizations such as Google or Yahoo Finance and pull them back into reports such as Excel or publish reports in the web. So we can do that on a daily basis, for example, currency rates for the last 2 years by day, and for longer reports we can bring out weekly average rates over, for example, the last 15 years. And that can be done for both currency rates and stock prices as well. The caveat here is that Sharperlight at the very minimum requires access to the internet on port 443.